Good evening, everyone. I'm Al. I'm here with Ari. This is Nonlinear Love. It's a podcast where we're going to tell stories of dating, romance, love, breakups, and last but not least, divorce in a non-prescriptive manner without any self-help soliloquies. We have with us this evening Margo Steines. She is a creative nonfiction writer. She teaches at the University of Arizona. Her work has been featured in the New York Times Modern Love column. She's a native New Yorker living in Arizona. She's the author of the book Brutalities, a love story that came out in 2023. It's a book that documents in a very raw and authentic voice Margo's relationship to pain, violence, and her body and how that's changed over time. It's Margo and her book are really the personification of resilience at its best. And so without further ado, Ari, if you want to start.
Sure. Thank you for joining us. So the book, it starts with some of your teenage years, but we were wondering if we could go all the way back to your childhood and if you could tell us a little bit about where you grew up and your relationship with your parents and just back to the beginning.
I will absolutely. It is not as interesting as one might hope. I had like a totally normal childhood. My parents are, functional, high-performing adults. I was given love and care, like all good things. I grew up in the Village in Manhattan. I went to a really cute little school where we talked about feelings and, the kind of school that I send my kid to. And we split time a little bit between the city and a house my parents had in Connecticut. So I also spent a lot of time I was really into riding horses, so I was a competitive horseback rider. I was in the pony club. That was my thing. My first obsessive thing, really. And, but I always, had problems a little bit, and I don't remember that. I don't remember much before my sister was born when I was 6, but I was, I think, a kid that now would very legibly have some depression, some social anxiety, probably some neurodivergence. But this was 80s, so it was just yikes, troubled, and it sort of devolved from there. And around the time the book picks up is I'm a teenager. I've been institutionalized a couple times already. I've been removed from several private schools by various mechanisms. I have, at that point, I still was not on track to graduate high school. And my father's an academic, education's a real value in my family. So really that I was going to just be uneducated by choice was kind of, I think, in my family of origin, the biggest sticking point. And now looking back, one of the bigger errors that I've made in judgment. But yeah, so, by the time the book picks up, I'm already wild, Are we being cautious with language on this podcast?
No.
Okay,
No.
I'm wild
Yeah.
as fuck.
Yeah.
Wild. I am bad.
Yeah.
I am a young woman that you can't leave around your husband, that will steal anything that's not, physically nailed down. A mess. I'm miserable. I'm having a bad time. And I was okay,
Was it just
now it
you
starts.
and your sister? Your younger sister?
I have a brother also who's 10 years younger.
But you were the oldest daughter.
I was the oldest. And I went to boarding school when I was 13, where I made it a year and a little bit. And then I was in all these institutions. So I was home, but not often at home. And then I left when I moved out when I was 17. So I wasn't really at home much after I was 13. Just a couple years here and there.
You wrote in the book, quote, "I first attempted suicide when I was age 11. I was then sent to a psychiatrist and dutifully swallowed multicolored prescription pills for years without understanding what they were or what they were meant to do." If you're comfortable telling us what happened.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I made a adolescent gesture towards suicide. I think I was really young. Now I'm did I really understand what that meant? But I was I was not confused. I was not looking for attention. I was really unable to tolerate how I felt. And for whatever reason, that felt like an option, And I don't know, I've like thought of, I'm like, why was that an option? You know, and there is definitely a lineage of mental illness in my family that I am, you know, the next iteration of. And I wonder sometimes like how much of it is really just like genetic and, you know, epigenetic, et cetera. But that happened. And then from that point on, I was sort of like the identified patient in the family, you know, and like my parents did a really good job getting me a lot of help, but it was like very medicalized and institutionalized, and I think not what I needed.
So you write, they sent me to a series of locked wards, hospitals, rehabilitation centers, recovery facilities, detox units, psychiatric institutions, therapeutic boarding schools. I was fully institutionalized, medicated to the hilt, and nearly out of my mind. What is, you know, what was that like, the series of institutions that you were sent to? And, you know, do you feel like your parents did the right thing in doing that?
That's a hard question. Like the right thing morally, like maybe it's not the choice I would make as a parent. I feel sure about that. I feel sure that they were acting out of care and, you know, wanted me to be safe, wanted me to, you know, stay alive. And, like, I don't think they ever had any bad intention, but I think I ended up in some situations that felt really bad, you know, based on the choices that they made. They also, you know, now that I'm older and I'm a parent, I'm like, oh, they had 2 other children. And I was like hectic to have around, you know. So do I resent the choices they made? Like, yeah, for sure. And then I also kind of understand them, you know.
Right.
But those places are not good. And, you know, I was sent to really nice ones. And then I've also been to like different quality ones, but even at the top tier of, you know, service quality or whatever, like when you're an adolescent, you have no rights. And if you're a young woman, like you have no bodily autonomy. You're in a place where like adult men work. Like it's just a terrible setup. Like I don't see how that works well, you know?
No.
So I was like in all these places and just like never really had freedom to like be as I wanted in the world and my body, and I fucking hated it. And I think each one just like I was like worse when I left because of that.
Right. How old were you when you first went to an institution?
The first one was when I left boarding school, I think, which was like I was probably like 14.
Yeah.
And when we were ultimately released, where in other words you were out of institutions for good.
Like the last time? Oh, that's a good question. I think the last time I went was to rehab for drugs when it was like shortly before I got sober. Maybe I got sober in 2006, maybe like 2004-ish. Yeah. That needs a fact check. But
how old were you then?
Like early 20s, somewhere between 18 and 23. That I know.
You wrote in the book about being so doped on Prozac and mood stabilizers and cocaine it would have taken a rocket launcher to register a sensation in my body. My habits included staying awake for 36 hours at a clip. Was that during the period when you were institutionalized or after?
That was when I was living in the city, like periodically trying to get sober and just like having a really hard time with substance abuse. In the early 2000s. Yeah.
How did things get to that point?
When I started using drugs, I was like, oh, this works very well. And there are a lot of options for how you get to feel, and you get to control all of them. And that felt good to me because I had always felt sort of like at the mercy of my emotional state and like pretty well into adulthood, actually, where I just couldn't deal with how I felt and I didn't know how to like change it. And then, you know, like heroin changes it very effectively. I was just so uncomfortable all the time. Like to be present and like look you in the face and like have a conversation was just impossible. And I had a terrible eating disorder. So like just in my own body, it was just like, oh, all the time, like just skin crawling. And so when I started using drugs, I was like, I just want to be able to do this all the time. And that's what I did. And that, you know, went about how it always goes.
Right.
And then like the wheels came off eventually.
So you, in the book, you say, you know, my parents never understood who I was or what I was running towards. And you sort of referenced just now, like this idea of not wanting to be in the present and wanting that escape. But what do you, and I can resonate with the idea of like my parents not knowing who I am at all. But I think, what did you think at that time you were running towards?
Some kind of freedom.
Yeah.
And it was like, I think I even kind of knew they were bad choices. Like I wasn't an idiot. But like I thought that kind of badness was sexy, and now I'm like, oh no, it's pathetic. Or like just like really sad, you know? But there was something about being like unhinged and harmed and harmful that I was really drawn towards, and I wanted the freedom to like make those bad choices.
So looking back in retrospect, why do you refer to it as pathetic and sad now?
Because I think someone who only wants badness for themselves like needs help, not and not the kind of help I got, unfortunately, but like a different kind of help. And like I want to be careful not to make any proclamations about people with similar behaviors that come from different motivations. But for me at the time, the way I was engaging in the world, like broadly, like sexually, interpersonally, financially, all the ways, was just like harmful to myself, to other people. I was moving out of, you know, fear and discomfort and selfishness just everywhere I went. And so I don't think making that like a lifestyle is like, I don't condone that. You know what I mean?
Right.
Whereas I think if you're really just like a libertine and you want to like be as you are and feel pleasure, like now I'm much more like that. And I'm like, that I can get behind. But the freedom I wanted was for like shit that wasn't good for anybody, you know?
Yeah.
When you wrote in the book about being picked up by a biker outside a pizza place where you went to bum cigarettes, you wrote, he had told me I was beautiful, pretty enough to make a lot of money working for him, and that back then was all it took. What did you mean back then?
When I was that age, and that, I mean, I think naive is the word. It's not a word I want to claim, but I think that's what it is. Yeah, I think I had a real lack of understanding about the downstream effects of the things I was doing, like on myself and my, you know, close circles.
But I also think, to your point about freedom, I feel like a lot of young women can feel like that is freedom in that moment.
For sure. And like, I think there is something about being young and like female and conventionally attractive that like all of a sudden you're like, it's just like you're getting
like,
a bunch of money all of a sudden. Totally.
Yeah.
You're like, this has spending value in the world, like on an actual literal level, you know? And so I think like for me certainly, and also I think for a lot of young people, like it's very intoxicating. You're like, I'm going to max this out. And I did.